Here's the point that nobody wants to say out loud right now. The United States did not stop bombing Iran because Iran begged nicely. It didn't stop because a ceasefire magically held. It stopped, at least in large part, because America looked into its own weapons closets in the middle of a live war and didn't love what it saw staring back. And that, guys, is a genuinely uncomfortable thing to sit with, because we are talking about the most powerful military machine that has ever existed on planet Earth, and somewhere behind the scenes, a 4-star general had to sit across from the President of the United States and basically say, slow down, we might not have enough bullets for the fight you actually want. So today we're pulling this whole thing apart. We're going back to how this war actually started, how a ceasefire that was supposed to hold for 60 days collapsed not once, but twice, how the bombing campaign quietly went from full throttle to a dead stop over the course of a single weekend, and then we're getting into the part that should genuinely worry you, which is what's actually sitting in the American and Israeli weapons stockpiles right now, what it costs to knock a single Iranian missile out of the sky, and why the answer to why did we stop might have less to do with Iran at all, and a whole lot more to do with a country that isn't even in this war yet. If you're new here, stick around, because this is one of those stories where every layer you peel back reveals something a little more unsettling than the last one. And hey, if you find this kind of breakdown useful, drop a like on your way through. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of coverage instead of the surface level headlines everyone else is scrolling past. Let's rewind to the beginning, because context matters here more than almost any story we could cover. This latest chapter of the Iran war effectively opened at the end of February this year, when American and Israeli aircraft launched a coordinated wave of strikes against Iran, and this wasn't some symbolic pinprick. This was a campaign that took out Iran's supreme leader along with a long list of senior officials, and hammered a huge number of military and government targets across the country. Iran, predictably, didn't just absorb that quietly. It answered with missile and drone attacks against Israel, against American installations, against US-aligned countries across the Middle East. And then it did something that actually rattled the entire global economy. It shut the Strait of Hormuz. If you don't know why that matters, just remember this single fact. An enormous share of the world's oil moves through that narrow stretch of water every single day. So when Iran effectively closes it, you're not just talking about a regional military spat anymore. You're talking about global trade taking a direct hit. In the opening days of that fight, Trump wasn't exactly whispering sweet nothings to Tehran. He put out a message that there would be no deal short of what he called unconditional surrender. Iran, naturally, was never going to just roll over and accept that framing, and an anonymous Iranian official pushed back publicly, essentially saying the war ends on Iran's own terms and conditions, not America's. Iran then floated a 5-point counterproposal of its own, calling for an end to strikes on Iranian and pro-Iranian forces in Lebanon and Iraq, security guarantees against future attacks, war reparations, and international recognition of its claim over the Strait of Hormuz. That last one alone tells you everything about how far apart these two sides actually were, because handing Iran unilateral control over one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet was never something Washington or the Gulf states were going to sign off on. By the end of March, other players started trying to insert themselves into the middle of this. Pakistan and China jointly put forward a 5-point initiative pushing for an immediate stop to the fighting and access for humanitarian aid. It's honestly kind of fascinating watching two countries that aren't exactly best friends with Washington try to play peacemaker here, but that's the world we're in now. Everybody's got skin in this game because everybody's economy runs through that region in one way or another. Then, in April, we got our first real ceasefire attempt, with Trump extending a pause in hostilities while negotiations continued, and the naval blockade against Iran stayed in place. That held sort of in the fragile way these things tend to hold, until things got formalized in mid-June with a memorandum of understanding signed on June 17th between the US and Iran. Under that deal, the Strait of Hormuz was supposed to stay open and free to international shipping for a minimum of 60 days, while the two sides worked toward something more permanent. For a minute there, it actually looked like this thing might cool off. Oil prices settled, shipping companies started breathing again, and then, like clockwork, it all came apart. The ceasefire fully collapsed when the United States carried out a second round of strikes in direct retaliation for Iranian attacks on commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. This wasn't some isolated incident either. There's a pattern that's played out repeatedly in this conflict. Iran hits shipping, the US answers with limited retaliatory strikes, and then Iran turns around and hits America's Gulf allies, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the cycle just spins again. Iranian officials were blunt about their position on the strait, with the parliamentary speaker publicly stating that Hormuz would only reopen on Iranian terms, not because of American pressure. Meanwhile, The vice president made it clear that keeping that artery open was non-negotiable for the United States, and that any attempt to shut it down again would trigger a military response. And that's exactly what happened. What followed was nearly 2 full weeks of consecutive nightly strikes on Iran, hitting military infrastructure, coastal areas, and reportedly areas around Iran's Bushehr nuclear power facility. This wasn't a light campaign. This was sustained, repeated, night after night bombing, the kind of operational tempo that burns through fuel, crews, aircraft maintenance cycles, and yes, munitions, at an absolutely staggering rate. Alongside the strikes, the U.S. reimposed a naval blockade, and by the numbers coming out at the time, forces had redirected roughly a dozen commercial ships, disabled 2, and boarded 2 more, all in the effort to choke off Iran's ability to move military supplies and generate revenue through its shipping lanes. Then, almost as suddenly as it ramped up, it stopped. On a Friday night, after nearly 2 weeks straight of strikes, the bombing campaign paused. A Pentagon source described operations as being put on hold. Trump, when asked about it, framed it as Iran essentially coming to the table and asking for a pause so both sides could meet and talk things through. And he made it clear that if no deal came together, strikes would simply resume. On the surface, that's a pretty tidy story, right? Aggressive regime gets pounded for 13 straight nights, taps out, asks for mercy. Diplomacy gets a chance to work. Nice clean narrative. Except here's the problem. Iran's own foreign ministry spokesperson stood up in front of cameras just days later and said, in no uncertain terms, that Tehran was not currently engaged in any negotiations with the United States at all, and that what currently existed could not even be honestly described as a ceasefire. He went so far as to say Iran would never let America dictate the timing of war and peace. So somebody's story doesn't add up here. Either Trump's framing was more optimistic than accurate, or Iran is playing its usual game of public defiance while quietly working the back channels. Possibly both. But if the official explanation is diplomacy, and the other side is openly denying that diplomacy is even happening, then you have to start asking what the actual reason for this pause really is. And that's where things get genuinely interesting, because the real answer appears to have almost nothing to do with what Iran said or didn't say, and everything to do with a closed-door meeting at the White House that took place right before the pause began. According to reporting that came out almost immediately afterward, the Vice President and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff both raised serious concerns during that meeting about the risks of escalating the war any further. And the chairman didn't just voice a vague worry, he specifically flagged the state of the American munitions stockpile as a real and pressing problem. One source described it as the chairman essentially telling the president that, yes, the military could absolutely carry out further operations and be successful in the short term, but he wanted the president to fully understand the broader implications of doing so before greenlighting anything else. Think about how significant that actually is. This is not some junior staffer scribbling a memo nobody reads. This is the most senior uniformed officer in the entire United States military, sitting across from the commander-in-chief and essentially putting his name on a warning that continuing this campaign could create problems well beyond the immediate fight with Iran. So let's talk numbers, because the numbers are honestly the part of this story that should be sending a chill down everybody's spine, whether you're a defense nerd or you've never thought about a missile interceptor in your life. During an earlier 12-day conflict with Iran, the U.S. reportedly fired more than 150 THAAD interceptors, and that figure alone is estimated to represent something like a quarter of the entire U.S. inventory of that specific interceptor at the time. Read that again. A quarter of the national stockpile of one of America's most advanced missile defense systems gone in 12 days against one country. Now roll forward into this current war, and in just the opening 5 days of renewed fighting, the U.S. is believed to have burned through roughly $2.4 billion worth of Patriot interceptors alone. $2.4 billion in 5 days. And by April, Internal Defense Department estimates put the total number of Patriot interceptors expended at more than 1,200, with each individual interceptor costing north of $4 million apiece. Some independent analysis has gone even further, estimating that American Patriot interceptor stocks may have plunged by as much as 65% since the war began. 65%. That's not a dent, that's a crater. And here's the part that really puts this in perspective. A single THAAD battery, just one battery, can cost approximately $2 billion to field, and the individual interceptor missiles that battery fires run somewhere between $12 and $15 million each. So every single time one of those interceptors leaves the launcher to knock down an incoming Iranian ballistic missile, you're essentially watching a very expensive luxury car get vaporized in midair, purely so that a much cheaper piece of Iranian hardware doesn't land somewhere it shouldn't. That's the brutal math of missile defense. You're almost always spending more to stop the threat than the adversary spent to create it. And when the adversary can keep manufacturing missiles faster than you can manufacture interceptors, that math starts working against you in a hurry. And it's not just an American problem either. Israel has been dealing with its own version of this exact same crisis. Multiple reports throughout this war described Israel warning the United States that its own supply of ballistic missile interceptors was running dangerously low, with one report at a particularly tense point in the conflict describing the remaining stock as having dwindled into what a source called double digits. Now, to be fair, Israeli officials have repeatedly pushed back against these claims publicly, insisting they have what they need and that reports of critical shortages are overblown. And honestly, that's a pretty normal thing for any country to say, because openly admitting your air defense magazine is nearly empty is basically an engraved invitation for your enemy to launch everything they've got at once. But even independent defense analysts who are skeptical of doom and gloom framing acknowledge that Israel's interceptor stock is absolutely finite, and that production timelines for replacing these systems are measured in months and years, not days and weeks. Israel had already entered this current war with a defense network strained from a previous round of fighting with Iran the year before, and reports suggest Iran has started equipping some of its missiles with cluster munitions, which massively complicates interception because now instead of stopping one warhead, you potentially need to stop several submunitions scattered across a wider area, and that just accelerates the drawdown on interceptor stocks even faster. Now, here's where you really need to lean in, because this is genuinely the piece of the puzzle that turns a normal wartime supply story into something a lot more unsettling. This entire war didn't start with a fully stocked American arsenal. The United States had already been quietly bleeding munitions for years before a single bomb dropped on Iran this time around. Officials have openly acknowledged that huge amounts of American weapons stock had already been sent overseas to support Ukraine's war against Russia, and additional stockpiles had been burned through defending shipping lanes against Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. So by the time this Iran campaign kicked off, Washington wasn't starting from a full tank. It was starting from something closer to running on fumes and hoping production could catch up. One U.S. ambassador even acknowledged publicly that the country inherited a difficult situation because so many munitions had already been handed over to Ukraine, with additional stockpiles expended fighting the Houthis, and that the plan going forward was to rebuild with cheaper, faster, more technologically capable systems, while the current campaign was still being conducted. That's a nice soundbite, but rebuilding an entire interceptor supply chain doesn't happen on a campaign timeline. It happens on an industrial timeline, and industrial timelines do not care how urgently a war is unfolding in real time. And let's be honest about how Iran fits into all of this, because Iran absolutely understands the math we just walked through, and Iran has been playing directly into it. This is a country that cannot match the United States, or Israel plane for plane, ship for ship, or precision weapon for precision weapon. So instead, it leans entirely into a strategy of attrition. Throw enough cheap missiles and drones at the problem over a long enough period of time, and eventually the other side's defensive stockpile becomes the actual limiting factor. Not the strength of your enemy's military, but the size of their ammunition closet. It's the classic move of a weaker power against a stronger one. You can't win a straight fight, so you make the fight expensive enough and long enough that the stronger power starts questioning whether it's even worth continuing. Analysts studying this exact dynamic have pointed out that Iran appears to be betting on the belief that Washington ultimately views Iran as a secondary adversary, rather than its primary long-term rival, and that at some point the sheer cost of depleting advanced air defense stockpiles against Iran will force American decision-makers to pump the brakes, especially with a much bigger, much more serious potential rival looming on the other side of the planet. And when you actually sit with that idea for a second, it stops sounding like some abstract geopolitical theory and starts sounding uncomfortably plausible. Because here's the actual terrifying part of this whole story, the part that goes well beyond just Iran, well beyond the Strait of Hormuz, and well beyond whatever ceasefire talks may or may not actually be happening right now. Every single Patriot interceptor, every THAAD round, every advanced air defense missile that gets fired at an Iranian ballistic missile or an Iranian drone is one less interceptor sitting in a magazine that was originally built and stockpiled with a very different adversary in mind. Defense analysts studying America's broader strategic posture have pointed out that missile interception has become one of the central battlegrounds of modern geopolitics, not because of Iran specifically, but because ballistic missiles have become the go-to strategic tool for regional powers trying to challenge American influence, whether that's China in its own region, Russia across Europe, or Iran in the Middle East. So, when the United States spends down its most advanced interceptor stockpiles fighting a regional power like Iran, it's not just weakening its position in one theater. It's potentially weakening its ability to respond quickly and effectively in a much bigger, much higher stakes theater on the other side of the world, one involving a peer competitor with a vastly larger military-industrial base and a much longer list of advanced missile systems of its own. And this is exactly why voices inside the Pentagon, all the way up to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who were reportedly the ones pumping the brakes on this campaign, not out of any particular sympathy for Iran, but because every additional night of strikes and every additional wave of interceptors fired represents resources that cannot simply be replaced overnight if a much larger, much more dangerous crisis suddenly demands them somewhere else. Framework agreements signed with major defense contractors earlier this year are aiming to eventually push annual production up toward roughly 2,000 Patriot interceptors and around 400 THAAD interceptors per year by the end of the decade. And additional large-scale production agreements have been signed to accelerate that even further. But here's the uncomfortable truth about defense manufacturing. Funding a contract and actually producing a finished, tested, deployable interceptor are two completely different timelines. The proposed defense budget for the coming fiscal year is asking for somewhere around $95 billion just for munitions, on top of an additional $21 billion war supplemental specifically meant to reinforce production and replace what's already been expended. Those are staggering figures, and they tell you everything about how seriously this stockpile problem is actually being taken behind closed doors, even while public messaging keeps insisting everything is under control. And speaking of public messaging, it's worth pointing out just how much spin has been layered onto this entire situation. Trump himself has publicly claimed the United States has what he called a virtually unlimited supply of munitions, a claim that, according to independent reporting, simply could not be verified. The White House communications director put out a statement framing the pause as a position of strength, pointing to what he described as crippling sanctions on Iran's economy and 13 straight days of strikes against military targets, essentially arguing it would be wise for Iran to negotiate now rather than face more of the same. That's a pretty standard piece of political messaging: project strength, downplay any hint of vulnerability, and put the pressure back on the other side. But when you line that messaging up against a Pentagon source privately telling reporters that operations were simply on hold, against a chairman of the Joint Chiefs specifically flagging stockpile concerns in a closed-door meeting, and against Israel quietly telling Washington its own interceptors were running critically low, you start to see two very different stories running in parallel: the confident public version and the considerably more anxious version happening in briefing rooms nobody outside the building gets to see. Now, is it possible the munitions concern wasn't the single deciding factor? Absolutely, and it's worth being fair about that. Multiple outlets covering this story have noted it remains genuinely unclear whether stockpile depletion was the primary reason for the pause, or simply one of several factors weighed alongside things like civilian casualty concerns and the broader risk of further regional escalation dragging in even more countries. War is never one clean, tidy explanation. It's usually a stack of overlapping pressures all hitting at once, and this situation looks very much like exactly that. But even if it wasn't the single deciding factor, the fact that America's most senior military officer specifically raised the munitions issue in that meeting at that moment, right before the campaign paused, tells you it was absolutely a factor serious enough to make it into the room where the actual decision got made. And that alone should tell you something about how tight things have actually gotten behind the scenes. Meanwhile, the underlying conflict is still very much unresolved, and it would be a mistake to read this pause as some kind of ending. Reports around the time of the pause indicated that even after nearly 2 weeks of intense bombing, something like 20% of the identified target sets in Iran were still standing, still active, still relevant. There were even reports that the regional command overseeing the campaign had recommended stopping operations specifically around the Strait of Hormuz because that particular front had essentially reached the limit of its effectiveness for the moment, while signaling that resuming larger operations to finish off that remaining 20% was very much still on the table. Trump himself has separately named Karg Island as a location of interest, and if you're not familiar with why that matters, that's the terminal responsible for moving the overwhelming majority of Iran's crude oil exports. Striking that facility wouldn't just be a military move, it would be a direct hit on the actual financial lifeline keeping the regime funded. And that's exactly the kind of target that tends to get held in reserve as leverage rather than used immediately. A card you keep in your pocket to make the other side sweat, rather than a card you play the moment you draw it. So where does that leave things right now? You've got Iran publicly denying it's in any active negotiations, while simultaneously insisting it will defend itself for as long as its interests require. You've got Washington publicly projecting strength and confidence while privately grappling with genuinely serious questions about how much longer its most advanced defensive systems can keep absorbing this level of expenditure. You've got Israel caught in the middle of its own version of this exact same crisis, torn between projecting confidence and quietly working every possible channel to restock. And you've got a defense industrial base back home that's throwing enormous amounts of money at the problem, but is fundamentally bound by the simple physical reality that you cannot manufacture precision-guided interceptors at the same speed you can fire them in combat. That gap between how fast these systems get used up and how fast they can actually be replaced is quite possibly the single most important number in this entire war, and it's a number that barely gets mentioned in most of the headlines you're scrolling past every day. And that's really the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this whole story. This isn't really a story about whether Iran is winning or losing, and honestly, it's not even really a story about whether the United States is winning or losing either. At least, not in the traditional sense most people think about when they picture a war. It's a story about whether the most powerful military alliance on the planet can actually sustain a prolonged fight against a determined, cheaper, more numerous set of threats without quietly hollowing out its readiness for an entirely different, much larger confrontation that most people aren't even thinking about yet. Iran figured that out early, and it's been playing directly to that vulnerability this entire time, trading cheap missiles for extremely expensive interceptors and just waiting to see who runs out of patience, or more precisely, who runs out of inventory first. So no, the pause in bombing almost certainly isn't some sudden outbreak of good faith diplomacy, no matter how it's being packaged for public consumption. It looks a whole lot more like a superpower quietly doing the math on its own weapons closet in the middle of a live war, and not entirely liking the answer it came back with. Whether that math gets solved by a genuine diplomatic breakthrough, by accelerated production catching up over the coming months, or by strikes simply resuming the moment Washington decides it's willing to accept the cost again, that part is still genuinely uncertain, and it's worth watching extremely closely over the next few weeks. What do you think the real reason behind this pause actually is? Diplomacy, dwindling stockpiles, or something else entirely that hasn't even made headlines yet? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is exactly the kind of story where the comment section usually ends up just as interesting as the video itself. And if this breakdown helped connect some dots you hadn't seen put together before, go ahead and hit subscribe, share it with somebody who's been asking what's actually going on with this war, and stick around, because this story is nowhere near finished. The next few weeks are going to tell us a lot about which version of the story turns out to be true.